Hi, James here from Adventure Bike Rider, and welcome to the ABR Garage. This is the first in a series of podcasts where we'll be discussing all things adventure biking. And we're kicking off the series by catching up with two of my favourite global motorcycle travellers, Simon and Lisa Thomas of Two Ride the World. In particular, I wanted to talk to Simon and Lisa about their travels across Australia on what's known as the world's longest shortcut, or the Outback Way. Now, you can read all about their Australian adventure in the latest issue of Adventure Bike Rider magazine, which is packed full of adventure biking knowledge, inspiration and entertainment. Pick up your copy at www.adventurebikerider.com. So, without further ado, let's catch up with Simon and Lisa. Now today I'm joined online by Simon and Lisa Thomas from Two Ride the World. Now if you're a regular reader of ABR, you'll probably recognise these two adventurers. They're regular contributors to the magazine in the travel section, and Simon also writes our masterclass photography section. Now between them, they've ridden for 16 years throughout the world, covered 500,000 miles. They've ridden across 80 countries, 6 continents, 36 deserts, and even suffered a broken neck in the Amazon. They're pretty inspirational adventure bikers. So welcome to the ABR Garage, guys.
Hi, morning.
Morning, James. That was really, really impressive. That was good. That was good. How many times have you done this podcast?
This will be the first time. You're our inaugural guests on the ABR podcast, so welcome. I hope you're feeling special.
Do you know what? I love to pop somebody's first premiere podcast.
Thank you very much. Thank you much. I feel privileged, I think. But moving on, the reason we're speaking to you guys today is a few weeks ago, Simon, you phoned me up and offered us a travel story for the latest issue of ABR magazine about the world's longest shortcut. Now, working at ABR, I tend to know of an awful lot of the iconic routes around the world, but I'd never heard of the world's longest shortcut. So I took him up on the offer, and we've got the story in the current issue of Adventure Bike Rider, which you can buy at www.adventurebikerider.com. So Simon, to begin with, and Lisa, what is the world's longest shortcut?
Well, it's actually also known as the Outback Highway. So those of you that are looking it up right now, Googling it, you can use both terms. It's actually mainly unsealed roads that take you from the northeast side of Australia right the way across diagonally to the southwest.
It's before we got to Australia, I've done a little bit of research.
What? You never do research. I'm the one that does the research.
Okay, some context here. I've watched Crocodile Dundee 3 times. Lisa actually opened books, went online, did some research.
Nice.
And we came up with the idea of riding basically east to west through the heart of the country. Now, bearing in mind that Australia is the world's 6th largest country. And although you read that, it's not until you get there that you really understand just how vast this place is. So Lisa, being Lisa, said, well, east to west has been done. Don't really fancy that. Let's do something that's a little bit more challenging. Now, that should have been the note for concern, because I went, yeah, okay, well, I'll leave it to you. Now, bearing in mind that whenever she chooses the routes, she leads, I follow. I'm always the one that gets hurt. It's worth mentioning as well that Australia has more deadly animals in one single state than most of the world put together.
Yep.
So she said, well, let's go from the most northeasterly point of the country, and by country I mean continent, down to the most southwesterly. So it took us 3 days to devise this route.
And it's all the research.
And only part of it is called the world's longest shortcut, which officially is, I think there's a very small town called Winton. It goes diagonally through the heart of the country, through Alice Springs, down to Laverton. Now, we actually started up on the coast. We started in, can you remember? Townsville.
Townsville, yeah.
So we started off on Tar, but the long and the short of it is we either went through or skirted, I think, about 7 deserts. But 2,500 miles of that route is off-road. Now, some of it's off-road, firm, hard gravel, so not terribly challenging. But there were short sections that were just corrugated nastiness or thick, deep pockets of what they call boulder. And tell you what is nice about being back in the UK. I can use words that the Americans don't get, like talcum powder. But imagine sand like talcum powder. You're driving along and suddenly you're flying over the handlebars because you've fallen into a hole that's 4 or 5 feet deep, 4 or 5 feet wide, that you simply couldn't see because there is a talcum powder sand over the top of it. It looks solid, but it's so fine.
It's like hitting concrete, bang.
Well, no, that's like hitting concrete. When you hit the bottom of the hole, the bike stops and you fly over the top.
Can I take you back to kind of before you started the route? What were you guys up to? Were you on your world travels? Had you taken a break? And how did you find yourselves in Australia?
Well, we've never really taken a break apart from when Simon decided to go into hospital for broken necks and things. We've been traveling continuously. And so this was on the final section of our travels through Asia. We started off going from Mongolia and Siberia, Central Asia, all the countries through there, and then dropping down through the Far East, so Thailand, Malaysia, etc. And we then did some island hopping through the Indonesian islands, which was fantastic.
Island hopping. Why is it when Lisa talks, she's so English? Because when Lisa describes our journey, it just sounds like a pleasant little vacation. Did some island hopping, you pop down, you pop into some ferries. What she means is we basically transited north to south the whole of Indonesia. Now, bearing in mind that's 27,000 islands, but yeah, we took in the major islands, which I think are 5 or 7.
Oh, I think it was 7, wasn't it? At the end of the day.
But this is a mix of islands that makes up a country that's got more volcanoes than a beach has pebbles. We ended up pit stopping in East Timor, and from there we had 10 days to arrange the shipping of our bikes and ourselves to Darwin, Australia. But it also took us that long to completely disassemble both bikes, absolutely clean them within an inch of their lives, because the quarantine restrictions in Australia are so tight that when your bikes or your gear land in Australia, they get infected. But I do mean literally at a surgical level. If there is a blade of grass, if there is an ounce of packing material, if there is dust, they do quite often just go, sorry, fail, turn around, head back to where you came from at your expense.
We actually had one of the quarantine guys lying on the floor underneath motorcycles when they eventually arrived in Darwin, putting his hands right the way up and feeling the top
with a white glove on,
suspension and everything, and coming out going, does this have any dust on it? I'm in East Timor, on our hands and knees with a toothbrush.
And would they really have,
everything.
They would have sent you back, would they? If they'd found something they didn't like, would they have, you would have been forced to turn around and head home rather than clean it on site? Oh, okay.
They charge you an incredible amount of money to then clean it. And so they can send you back if it comes in and it's absolutely filthy and you've not done anything, and they can go, well, we're not accepting that, and then you pay for the charges to go back where you came from.
But this isn't just the bike. This is any of your gear.
Yeah.
So tent pegs, tents, quite literally everything that goes in. You can't take any organic material. So, for example, we had a collection. Well, Lisa had a collection of wooden cooking utensils that we've been carrying for a decade plus. That had tremendous sentimental value. Those either had to get thrown away or wrapped up and sent somewhere because you can't take that into the country.
Oh wow! So you made it in without hiccups? Was that right? Yeah. And you headed down
into Darwin. But we headed in. First of all, we took the main Northern Highway, and we went basically headed south before taking a left on the main road, and it is as easy as that. A left on the main road towards Brisbane. And we were heading towards Brisbane because there was a Horizons Unlimited rally going on. And we've been asked to go there and just entertain people and chat about our journeys, etc.
Well, that wasn't the only reason we wanted to go. The other reason was that there were people that had been traveling for a very long time, basically people that we'd idolized for a long time that were going to be there. And we had a chance to meet them. One of those couples was Peter and Kay Forward. For anyone that is interested in travel, go online, look up Peter and Kay Forward. Lovely couple, traveled for a very, very long time. It's not a Harley, and I think they hold a number of world records. And we got to meet our idols and hang out and chat and talk about them.
And it was also at that time it was my 50th birthday, so I had a 50th birthday party with all the other travellers. It was, and I had a massive birthday cake. It was great. It was a lovely way to celebrate 50.
And
Cool.
that's interesting to me. You talked about meeting kind of people that you admire, and you guys are iconic travelers. You're well known throughout the world. But do you still get a little starstruck at meeting people that you look up to in the motorcycle world?
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I just love meeting like-minded people who have been through a lot more experiences than us, a lot earlier on, like Peter and Kay Forward, and like Ted Simon. I mean, all those.
Sam Manicom. Hi,
yeah.
Sam. Yeah, because it's also one of those, when you remember your own travels, the shine is often taken off a little bit when you remember your own travels, because your brain also remembers the slog of it, the challenge, the difficulty. Yeah, there's a sense of pride that comes along overcoming those challenges. But when you talk to other people about their travel, your imagination kicks in. And for some reason, I do anyway, I always imagine their travels to be a little bit more glamorous, more challenging, more demanding, just generally more, because my imagination kicks in and that's how I presume it. Now, I know rationally that they went through the same kind of slog as we've done in certain places. But when you meet other travelers, especially long-term travelers, or people that have traveled or done anything that you admire, yeah, I just kind of, hi, how are you? I'm not quite sure what to say.
For me, it almost reinvigorates me. It's being able to share experiences with somebody that have experienced it in the same way that you have, on two wheels and the hardships that can go with that. You just sit down and it's not there's no kind of competition. It's not like, oh, I went here, why didn't you do this? Or,
well, there shouldn't be.
I rode 50 more miles on dirt than you did. There's nothing like that, as Ora Simon says, there shouldn't be. And luckily with the guys that we have met whilst we've been on the road, there is none of that. It is a sharing of enthusiasm. And this is why I like to meet other long-term travelers.
I think when you do meet anyone that's chosen to challenge themselves, or dealt with anything like that and succeeded, the world has a very interesting way of just qualifying exactly how small and unimportant you actually are. And when you meet travelers that have been to a number of countries, especially developing parts of the world, your perspective on what is or isn't a problem changes. And yeah, you tend to take yourself far less seriously than perhaps you once did, because you have that new perspective. And we've got great friendships with people that have traveled extensively, because of their perspective on life, and that's been given to them by their choices and their journey.
Good stuff. So you've had your birthday party. You survived the hangovers, I'm assuming, for a few days, and you're about to set off on, across one of the most remote parts of the world. Petrol stations are scarce. Towns are many, many miles apart. Even access to things like water, I'm assuming, was troubled. So, how do you prepare for a journey like this? Did you spend a lot of time doing that, or do you just jump in?
No, you have to prepare yourself. It's a dangerous area, and you cannot run the risk of running out of water or fuel. So you do have to plan ahead. But that is quite difficult because being on motorcycles, you can only carry so much fuel, you can only carry so much water. I kind of made a bit of a plan ahead and going, okay, we've got, I think it was 260 kilometers was the longest distance between a fuel stop. And it's not a real fuel stop. You go into somebody's homestead and hopefully they will have some fuel.
Or hopefully they're open.
Yeah.
With Australia, we both ended up doing a fair bit of research because, all the jokes aside, Australia is still one of those countries that has a nasty bite if you don't start off your travels respecting it. So, Lisa and I have been through a number of deserts. We've got a fair degree of experience on our side, but even so, we both realised very early on that, first of all, there wasn't an awful lot of up-to-date information in terms of what stations were and weren't open. So we had to, when we set off from the northeast coastline, we weren't absolutely sure that the stations that we were going to rely on for primarily water and fuel were going to be there. There was at least 2 stations where we just couldn't get any information, and Lisa and I did have a conversation where we went, okay, do we just take a chance, bearing in mind that if we get stuck between these 2 stations and we realize that the one we're going to isn't available, isn't open, isn't manned, there is no get out of jail free card, there isn't anyone you can call, there isn't any insurance, we then have to make a plan and somehow survive that. And I think the longest gap between point A and point B was 360 miles. Now we have enough fuel for that because I had one of those large Touratech fuel tanks on my bike. Lisa had 3 fuel tanks on hers. But the issue was that because of the terrain, some of it was steel, some of it was gravel, some of it was sand. The minute you hit the gravel and the sand, of course, your rear wheel is spinning. Your riding style changes and you end up burning up an awful lot more fuel. And I think we made that 360 miles on fumes. We were pretty close to being very, very empty. But the biggest issue actually is that fuel with water. It's so hot and you end up burning through so much water. Without water, you are putting yourself in harm's way if you can't restock and rehydrate.
Yeah, and you guys were on, am I right in thinking you're on the BMW bikes, your brand ambassadors for BMW Motorrad. So was it the GS 1200 you were on, Simon, and was it the 800, Lisa? No,
not at that point, no. We were still on our original bikes that we left the UK with back in 2003. And I was on a modified F650 GS with the large Touratech tanks. And you had...
I was riding Tinkerbell, the original Tinkerbell. With a modified R1100 GS that kind of morphed into a bit of an 1150 because I borrowed bits and bought bits and put things on as we travelled. But no, those bikes got retired. They're in a museum in the USA, but they did 420,000 miles.
And how did the name Tinkerbell come about?
Honestly, I just thought it was the most inappropriate name for a bike that size.
The real story?
Yes, please. No, please do.
Tinkerbell, one of Simon's favourite actresses at that time was Julia Roberts.
Okay.
And she played Tinkerbell, and he just loved her wide smile and how she looked. And so it was called Tinkerbell. My bike was called Tarzan.
Nice. Good stuff. It's a bit of a
So why
tougher
is
name.
your bike called Tarzan, Lisa?
Well, it's obvious, isn't it? I mean, I know motorcycles are meant to be girls, like cars and ships and things like that. But no, my motorcycles are rusty, tusty boys. So my original one was Tarzan, and this one is Taz, for the Tasmanian Devil.
Okay. Yeah.
Apparently, that's how I ride.
Wasn't that a nice segue? Unplanned. Sorry, Australia. What were we talking
So
about?
Tinkerbell, Tarzan on the road. So you're on the bikes. You've got the Touratech tanks. Was there anything else you did to modify the bikes for the journey ahead?
Not for Australia. I mean, again, most of the key modifications were actually made in 2001, 2002, ready for our departure in 2003. And not an awful lot of the key mods changed, and there wasn't anything we did for Australia. Much like the Sahara, or even the Bolivian Altiplano, where that these areas are not inhabited. The biggest issue is water, and so we had to carry as much fuel as possible. We didn't carry extra fuel to the Australian outback, but we did carry extra water. Mm-hmm. We ended up carrying, I think, we had 53 litres of water.
Oh, wow.
Now, bearing in mind, that also means you've got an additional 53 kilos of weight.
Yeah.
And so that affects tires pressure, riding style, and what you can and can't do with the bikes, because they're already, ridiculously heavy.
I'll just go back to the question that you had there, James, that we didn't make any specific modifications for that section in Australia, but some of the mods that we had already made for the bikes, because of previous terrain like this, we've both changed our suspension. We were both running with a 21 front wheel.
That made a very big difference. That made more of a difference to the 1150 than it did to the 650, just because of the extra weight. And yeah, rolling over holes, rolling over lumps, rolling over rocks on a heavy bike with a larger front wheel. So instead of hitting it and going over, you're rolling over these things. Makes a huge difference to not just the damage done to the bike or the potential damage, but it also makes a huge difference to just the levels of exhaustion or fatigue that you feel as a rider.
And I've changed out the front forks to more progressive springs, and that made a big difference as well. But that was the main thing that we had already done to the bike. But if anybody was just thinking about, Australia, what should I be looking at? And they were going to be doing a lot of the off-road and field roads. Then those are the things that I would say people should consider.
And a quick plug, if you're interested in any of the modifications, you go to toridetheworld.com, and that's with the number 2, and just click on the link to the bike. We've actually listed the vast majority of the mods done to the F650, the 1100, and now the 800 and the 1200. And we try to give as much detail as we can as to whether it was good, bad, indifferent, why we did it, and how we found the modifications helped us.
Good stuff. And even with bikes modified, the terrain, I know from reading the story in the latest issue of ABR was incredibly challenging. And I know, Lisa, was it pretty early on that you had it off in some pretty slick gravel and sand?
Yes, it was. What do they call the little? It was the
glass something or other.
Yes, there's a name for it, and it wasn't just stones. It was like circuit. It was like riding on marble.
Yeah.
It was horrible terrain. Just for a short section, very deep, and the bike just kind of flipped itself and smacked me off. And unfortunately, I was underneath it. One of my petrol lines from one of the main tanks at the front came off, and as I was kind of underneath it with the bike on my shoulder, and one of the fuel lines came off. I couldn't move, and the fuel started to fill my goggles. And we all know what fuel is like when it gets to the eyes.
Yeah.
It's not very nice. And I could not get out, and it was just clogging up my eyes. And eventually Simon, came along and helped the bike off me.
But it took a while. So right from the beginning of the journey, we had comms between the bikes. Initially, we didn't think it was a great idea because we both like riding in our own headspace, but it became apparent pretty quickly on, certainly at the start of Africa, that having comms between the two bikes meant that we can communicate and identify if there was a problem. But in Australia, we actually had to separate, we had to increase the distance between Lisa and myself because of the huge amount of dust the bikes are kicking up. So I've actually gone over several brows of the hill, and I'm actually ahead of Lisa by quite a long way, to the point where I can't hear her. And I pulled over, and I'm looking back, and seconds become minutes become a little bit longer. I'm thinking, well, maybe she's pulled over. She should have caught me by now. And then I stop and I wait, because you wait for another minute or two, and another minute goes by, thinking, well, in a second she'll come into view. Well, she didn't. So I then suddenly went from being kind of cool about it to being panicked, turned around, headed back. With each meter I'm riding, she's nowhere in sight. So with each meter, I'm getting more and more anxious until I round a bend, and there's Lisa on her bike. And as I get round, she's literally just managing to pull herself out. But clearly she's in an awful lot of pain. I had no idea what happened in terms of the goggles. But luckily, and again, this is all down to Lisa. Prior to starting from the northeast coast of Australia, Lisa had decided to add to the medical pack an eye wash. Now, we've never carried one. We've never carried an eye wash, but lo and behold, in her wisdom, she thinks, I'll go and buy one. And that's what and just on this one occasion, for the next half an hour, she was using eye wash and then our own water, just to get as much fuel out of her eyes as possible. And I think we were there for about an hour.
I think had I not done that, there may have been some lasting damage, because it was really painful. But this is another thing. You mustn't forget that you work on prepping the bikes and making sure that they're able to take on a part of a trip like this. You've got to look after yourself as well. So make sure you've got your medical kit, and it's easily accessible, not at the bottom of the pannier. Luckily, ours was on the outside of the pannier. And you have things in there, even though Simon went, "Oh, what do you want that for?" It was just one of these things that I think, yeah, that might actually be a very good idea.
I have a habit of making myself look absolutely stupid for anyone that's met me watching it. Oh yeah, we know that. Lisa will do something, and I'll belittle it, and I'll go, what do you want that for? Only to be proven that it was an absolutely brilliant decision. And she's been doing it for 25 years. I just don't learn.
I just ignore it and go, yeah, whatever, and do it anyway. And so, yeah, it don't always just think about the route that you're taking and organising your fuel and your water, which is obviously important, and suspension on the bike. Think about your medical kit. Think about your own fitness level.
But hang on, I just want to touch back on something Lisa mentioned a minute ago, because that really is a top tip. Most riders that we do speak to that plan on going out for short rides or long rides, normally they'll carry some kind of medical kit, and if you do go and grab one, they're not expensive. But the number of riders that we have spoken to who take their medical kit and they bury it somewhere deep in their bag because they use it so infrequently. And that is an absolute top tip. Take your medical kit, put it somewhere that it can be stolen. Not on show, doesn't have to have a big red cross on it, but put it in a bag that can be accessed super easily, because when you have need for it, when you have a problem, when you're bleeding or injured, you need to be able to get to it as easily and as quickly as possible. And you know what? If someone does come along and take it, chances are they needed it far more than you did. Go and order another one. They're not expensive, but put it somewhere easily accessible on your bike. Don't bury it.
Good stuff. A top tip for your next summer tour. So Lisa, you were cleaning out your eyes. I assume, reading the story, you felt strong enough to go on. Were there any repairs needed on the bike or anything like that?
Yeah.
Well, you say feel strong enough to go on, you don't have a choice, do you? Really?
No.
You choose to do a journey or a route like this, and there's no one on the end of the phone. Oh, I've had a little accident. Can you come and get me now? I feel bad.
We haven't seen anybody in 2 days. We were looking for a camp spot. We were still a couple of hundred miles away from where we needed to be. So yeah, you just
carry on. It's just one of those things. Take responsibility.
But the bike did need to be repaired.
It did need to be repaired. Yeah, bash the handguard. That's another thing. Have good handguards. Bash the handguard. And without the handguard, I may actually have broken my wrist because I hit with such
Actually,
a
with the handguard, it was the end. It was the left-hand side of your handlebar, and it was the lever.
Yeah.
And I ended up using zip ties and metal glue, 2-part epoxy, to try and jam things back together again.
And I flipped up the foot peg again. I've had the foot pegs that can actually move. Had I not, then that might have been broken off. There's all little things like this that you think, oh, what if? And yeah, they were good mods.
Well, the thing is, I think Lisa was doing a pretty decent speed when she came off, because the bike actually, according to Lisa, because she didn't knock herself out, the bike did flip and almost somersault. Because we couldn't work out why there was tiny little scratches at the top of her screen.
Yeah.
And the only way this was got there was because the bike came up, somehow grazed the top of her screen, but didn't actually flip all the way. So it did flip side to side.
Actually, what I did, because it was kind of entertaining, I'm looking at all the scratches.
You're so proud of this, aren't you?
And I was like, how did that happen? And then I'm like, oh, I remember that. So I hit one side. I was going a little speedy, a little fast. So I went up onto the tip and the nose and the screen. But instead of it flipping right way over, it then smacked onto the other side. And so all the scratches that I had on the bike were mainly from that one.
We were trying to do some pretty big miles because of water and fuel resources. And one of the things, you start out in the morning, you start off on a reasonable speed. You're trying to be careful, but after a while,
you relax into
it, and you get a little bit blasé, and every hour you tend to find that your speed is just increasing a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more until you realize that actually you're driving too fast for either your skill set or the terrain. And one of the issues we had with Australia was that the terrain would change so quickly from hard packed into that bull dust Holcomb paddle like thing,
corrugation,
or suddenly on a corner, not a steep corner, you'd have these, this ripio like material. Ripio, that's what they call it in southern Argentina. They're like marbles. They're rounded off, and there's nothing you can do other than steer into the corner and try and survive it and get out. And on this instance, Lisa didn't. But it's a very hard reminder of, hey, you're in Australia, you better respect me, or I'm going to bite you.
Yeah, and I know that one of the other things riding in Australia that you have to bear in mind is the local wildlife. And I know people often talk about the venomous spiders and snakes and scorpions and so forth like that. But on the road, I'm assuming you guys had to keep an eye out for the likes of kangaroos and larger animals to make sure that they didn't take you out.
That is a brilliant insight, actually, because when you read about Australia, I mean, you tap into Google dangerous animals Australia, and you get the spiders and the snakes. But the reality is that
the kangaroos are so dangerous.
Sure, what shouldn't we do? Which is a great habit to get into. And every single Australian we spoke to said, do not ride past dusk in the outback because the kangaroos are moving more. And you won't see them. And I'm thinking, well, some of these things are 8 foot tall. How can you not see
them? But they're the same colour as the terrain.
Especially the red ones, which are even larger.
And quite literally, they're kind of leaning back. Are we going to jump out?
One evening, we went into the dusk. We didn't have any choice. We were trying to get some fuel. Lisa was behind me, and I was keeping my eye out. I was scanning for kangaroos
all the time.
And in a split second, my peripheral vision to my right picked up what I thought was a foot, some hair, and a tail, and a whole bunch of dust. And in a split second, I was past it. And Lisa's saying to me in my ear, "You just had a near-death experience." Basically, a kangaroo was, I don't know, 20 or 30 feet away. He covered that distance in 2 or 3 hops. As he got towards me, he landed very close, was startled in a way that said, "I didn't see him," which is odd because it's a big bike and it's loud. And somehow managed to pivot on his haunches and his tail. Yeah. Lisa said he missed you by inches.
Oh, wow.
Had he connected, I'd be dead. And parts of Australia actually look like some kind of combination between Mad Max and the goriest horror film you can think of. Because these gigantic land trains, we call them, they'll have 3 or 4 articulated sections. So these are gigantic trucks like you'll see on, M5, M6. But instead of having one body at the back, they'll have 4, 5 or more. They're called road trains. They have bull bars on the front that Mad Max would be proud of. But what happens is a herd of kangaroos will move across. I'm not sure. Will move across the road in the evening, or I like gangs actually more appropriate.
They sound a little menacing.
Or just sit on the road in the evening to the wall. And we'll drive along, and you will find half a mile of just blood and fur clasped, because these road trains hit them, and they don't hit 1 or 2, they'll hit 20 or 30.
Oh, wow. And
they'll just keep going, and there's just this massive gore. And the first time we saw it, I think we went, did we photograph? What the? I mean, it's just bizarre.
I wasn't sure that we were ever going to see a live kangaroo in Australia.
And the road gets really slippy. We hadn't read that in the guidebook.
Yeah.
No.
No one mentions this carnage. It's one of those.
But yeah, wow. The advice of don't ride at dusk. Drive at dusk is a really good one to follow.
There's too many kangaroos. Yeah. They're too unpredictable, and you can't guard against it. And you hit one of those, even the small ones, and there's going to be consequences. So yeah, we got lucky.
And when you camp, if they turn up near your camping area, you've got to be very careful, because they can be quite aggressive. I had one come up once, and I'm cooking, and it kind of bounced near me, looked at me, and hissed. And it was bigger than Simon. It was a massive thing. And I thought, I never knew that kangaroos hiss, but it did. It kind of like bounced, looked at me, and bounced off again. I was really quite concerned, because I could see others in the area as well. And I'm like, I don't want to be ganged up on and beaten up.
We're going with gang, aren't we?
We are. It's going to be gang. Yeah.
Okay. Gang it is. It's funny, writing the article for you guys and talking about it now. We're remembering things that we haven't really talked about since we left Australia, because we tend to leave one place and all our lives are then filled with the next destination. But it's wonderful to be able to just remember some of these aspects of what was. Yeah, I don't know what I expected from Australia, but I don't think I expected to be quite so blown away by the sheer scale of the country, the diversity of the country, the landscape, or some of the challenges we faced. Whether it's kangaroos. I mean, again, until a minute ago, I'd forgotten Lisa and that still on those marbles, and it was a pretty good one, and could have had nasty consequences had she not reacted as quickly. I think we do get a little bit blasé about the travels and some of the stuff. And Australia was a good way of having one country or one continent go, don't take this for granted.
Yeah, and you wrote very eloquently in the article about the remoteness, the pristine beauty, and in particular about approaching Uluru or Ayers Rock, which is kind of, world famous. It's one of those, it's on the tourist trail. But it was interesting to see that you guys, despite how far you've traveled in the world, seem to be genuinely affected by the sight of it where you were. Can you explain a little bit about that?
I think we were both. I think I was. I mean, I'm more of the Philistine, believe it or not, than Lisa. And we've seen. We've grown up watching Ayers Rock on National Geographic and TV shows and David Attenborough. And that it's this massive rock that's sitting in the middle of nowhere. And I think, okay, honestly, I went along to Ayers Rock almost as a duty call because you can't go and not see it, and we were quite close. But when I got there, there is genuinely something incredibly special, almost spiritual about the landscape, and I can't put my finger on it or definitively describe why, but it's definitely there.
When you approach it, you've seen pictures of it, you know what it's going to look like. It's not going to be a surprise. But when you're approaching it, the light changes on it from every angle, and it kind of shines from a very, very flat terrain, and suddenly there it is, and you can't take your eyes off it as you're approaching it.
So in your story, in the latest issue of ABR, you wrote about the costs of travel in Australia. And at one point you said that it cost £155 to fill up 2 bikes. That seems a huge amount of money for people traveling the world. How do you budget for something like that?
It's not something you can really budget for. I mean, bearing in mind, when we set out in 2003, we planned to travel for a year and a half. So a decade into the journey, any idea of budgeting really stopped, and it's just a case of then trying to survive on as little as possible, not doing the usual tourist things. And Australia was brutal. One Outback stop, we had a pack of sandwiches which we shared. I think we had a coffee or a Coke which we shared, and we put the fuel into the bikes. Now, yes, we did we filled up the bikes to the brim because of the distance we were covering, but handing over 150 pounds was an absolute shock. But Australia, whilst we were there, was going through a boom. They'd found massive mineral reserves in the northwest of the country, and the price of everything had gone up massively, but also the salaries. So you had college kids leaving college at 18, 19, getting their lorry licenses, going up to work for the mines, and going home with £150,000 a year because the salaries that were being paid were just ridiculous. You had entire towns and villages evacuating overnight to make room for the miners who needed somewhere to rent, because basically the mining companies were paying just ridiculous amounts of money for rent. So yeah, £150. But in terms of saving money, we camp and cook for ourselves. To get a motel room.
Impossible.
It was £150. It was just utterly ridiculous.
So we also wanted to see Australia by camping through it and getting right off the beaten track and experiencing not so much the towns and the cities, but what I considered the real Australia, which was the outback. And so you had no choice but to camp. And in the long run, it's wild camping. I think we only used set camp areas when we were by Kings Canyon and by Uluru. As the rest of the time, that was by Kings Canyon.
No, it wasn't.
Moving on.
The rest of the time we just did the wild camping, but we managed to save quite a lot of money coming down through the islands of Indonesia, whereas the average Asia generally, the average income of the islands was $1.50
a day.
So you can buy your food and go and get a roadside snack, and it's literally pennies.
Well, even the fuel. I remember Indonesia was a complete revelation. The food was fantastic, great camping, stunning country. Bearing in mind, as I mentioned earlier, it's just 27,000 islands that are above sea level on this volcanic chain. So incredibly rich land, volcanoes everywhere. But yeah, you could fill up the fuel, have a meal, and you're looking at $6 or $7. And again, our brains were working in dollars at the time. We then got on a plane, on East Timor. We flew an hour to Australia, and suddenly in that hour, the daily salary had gone from £1.50 to $150 per day.
You guys were traveling through some pretty rugged country. And I'm assuming you met some pretty rugged locals as well, whether they were Aboriginal community or the miners and so forth. What was the response from locals along the route to two Brits discovering their country by bike?
Actually, Australia, in terms of the people we met, was absolutely fantastic.
Great.
And again, I reminded you so much of sections of Crocodile Dundee, and sorry to say that, but it really did.
Did you tell them that?
As experienced travelers, you try and leave those stereotypes behind, and you try and form your own opinions. But oh my God, so many times we would meet somebody or we'd have a conversation, especially, one conversation with these two truckers comes to mind. And the Australian language, it is not English. The Australian language is...
We're going to get hate mail now.
So there was one conversation we had with these couple of orange truckies. They're called truckies.
Don't go through the accent.
Every word gets shortened. And honestly, it was like having a conversation with two bearded versions of Crocodile Dundee. I mean, they did everything apart from the whole finger with the wild animals thing.
Yeah, they did.
And then also, and this is a great tip, by the way, I think Australians potentially have the worst memory for names in the world. That's what I was told by an Australian friend, because I said to him, why do you call everybody mate? Because you're either mate, or there's old mate, or there's young mate. And he said to me, well, it's because he can't remember each other's names, so everyone's a mate. But there's also some pretty big cultural shocks. So we've been traveling through Muslim countries for 3 years. Lots of being covered up.
And also the distancing between the opposite sex.
Yeah.
You wouldn't walk along the street holding hands, and there was no hugging, greetings, and the sexes were separated to a certain extent.
Certainly publicly. And after 3 years of being in these regions, we get to Australia, and there was a degree of shock. So we were meeting up with a buddy of ours called Gary. He was just south of Darwin, and this quick story talks of the size of the country. So our bikes are in quarantine. We've got a week and a half where we can't get our bikes. Gary said, come and stay with us. Now, we'd met Gary traveling on his KTM in Mali years and years earlier. We said, Gary, how do we get to you? Gary said, well, come down to my house, get the 23 bus. And we said, well, how do we get to you? He said, oh, it's easy. Go past the first two stops, there'll be a left, take the next right, and you're there. 90 miles into the bus journey, we think we're on the wrong bus. What the hell's going on? It ended up being almost a 100-mile bus journey just to do past the first two stops, a left and a right. Gary said, well, don't meet me at my house. Get off the bus, meet me in this bar. We get off the bar, and all I'm doing is staring, because no one's mentioned the fact that this one Outback, it wasn't even an Outback bar. It wasn't. It's news being served evening, and all the waitresses are absolutely topless with librarians. And all these cool Aussie guys just hanging out like it's completely natural. I've been in Muslim countries for 3 years. I've always been dying. I'm just going, stop staring. I'm like, what am I meant to do?
Yes.
It was a complete and absolute just culture shock. There's so many stories.
Just needed to send him outside and calm him down. Put him in the beer garden with a beer.
I am. This is my podcast for so much time. Australia was absurdly friendly. There is a level of hospitality that is unique to Australia.
You guys, I could talk to you all day about this, but I'm sure you've got lots of other things to do. It's a fascinating story and a fascinating journey. But I guess my last question is, you've travelled through tough terrains, you've had great riding, you've marvelled at wonderful landscapes, and felt fantastically warm hospitality. So as you ended the journey in Perth on the west coast of Australia, when you're reflecting on it, how does it rank with your other journeys throughout the world and your other travels?
I think Australia as a singular journey would be in the top 10. And I'm surprised to hear myself say that, because a lot of the other countries in terms of the riding that are in the top 10 are very mountainous and have, great terrain.
But I do think our preferred areas are where you're quite isolated. You might not see a person, you might not meet any locals or any other travellers for 5 or 6 days. Those are the areas that we prefer, because we feel we're getting to really know the country, the terrain.
We like being challenged. Yeah. We like being a little bit on the edge. And whether it's Lisa every morning saying, Simon, can you go outside and do the thing? And I'd say, well, what's the thing? And what should we make? Can you go and put your hand in both of the sets of motorcycle boots to make sure there's no poisonous spiders?
Yeah.
Bearing in mind, if I do find one, I'm the one getting bit on the hand.
Sounds like a sensible system, but
yeah, it's like the Amazon. Oh, go bridge. Simon, you go first. But whether it's the riding, whether it was the speed, I mean, we Australia offered a little bit of everything, and I think when you're challenged, whether it's emotionally or physically, that's when Lisa and I feel the most alive. We get bored very, very easily. But between the hospitality, the riding, the distances,
the terrain,
the
scenery, and it's also great as photographers, which I suppose we can now call ourselves. It's just the terrain and the landscape, the sky, the animals. It's a photographer's paradise.
You are left with the feeling that Australia is ridiculously old as a continent and as a country.
And, night skies.
Oh, good Lord.
The night sky. There is nowhere else that we've experienced in the world where the night sky is as spectacular as it is across Australia.
Because in the Outback, you have such a small population. It's one of the least inhabited parts of the world. Therefore, you have very little pollution and light pollution, and you can see more of the Milky Way than we've seen on any other continent on Earth. But yeah, the photographic opportunities are vast. But no, Australia, I'd say top 10.
Yeah, definitely.
Excellent. It's brilliant to hear about the journey. I thoroughly enjoyed editing and reading it, and you can read about Simon and Lisa's journey along the Outback Highway in the latest issue of Adventure Bike Rider magazine, which you can buy at www.adventurebikerider.com. And if you want to find out more about Simon and Lisa's travels, visit toRideTheWorld.com. But guys, thanks so much for joining us. It's been a fantastic insight. Hope to see you guys out on the road again soon, and thank you very much.
It's been great.
Our pleasure. Thanks so much for your time, mate.
Bye.